Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Middle East, which is plagued with chaos, has become a playing ground for both the United States and Russia, even though not entirely comparable, to try and achieve a domestic perception of superiority on the one hand, while advancing a regional strategy that would outmaneuver the other and would not grip either of them in an undesired position, which would leave one of them in disadvantage. With us to discuss this matter are Mr. Owen Alterman, a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies on U.S. foreign policy. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Owen, and Ms. Paula Slier, Russia's Today's Middle East bureau chief. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with a question to you, Amir. The United States and Russia have been not best of friends. It never really happened in the past. It still isn't that reality today. What is going on in the Middle East with what's going on in Syria, in Iran, and other places across the region, as well as here in Israel?
Well, earlier this week, we had this surprise of the Russian pullout, or the beginning of some pullout from Syria. So perhaps we should approach our analysis with some modesty, because much as the Russian intervention was not foreseen by most analysts, so was the beginning of the end of this pullout. But having said that, the United States and Russia are really partners here. They look like they are competitors, but there is more cooperation than competition, some division of labor, and perhaps one could see that Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama have found a way to have a dialogue and coordinate most of their moves.
Very interesting. Mr. Owen, how do you view this situation?
It's a very interesting theory and a comment by Mr. Oren here, and there is certainly an overlap of interest. Both the United States and Russia want to see ISIS defeated or at least degraded, to use the administration's phrase. The United States is at least ambivalent about the result and about the continuation of the Assad regime. Russia does want to see Assad have at least a measure of control over Syria. So there is an overlap of interest. And the United States is happy to take a backseat and happy not to get involved because of the fear of being embroiled in some kind of long-term war. And that seems to be one of the reasons behind Mr. Putin's decision.
Mm-hmm. How do you view this, Ms. Slier?
Well, Amir, you said the two sides are on the same side at the moment, but I think most people would agree that initially the whole Syria story saw Russia and the United States at loggerheads with each other. And I think what's interesting is how Russia has come out of the whole Syria scenario. Take us back a few months, and Putin was the pariah of Western leadership, and now nobody can talk about the future of Syria without actually involving the Russians. So I think in that respect, the Russians played their cards very well. I think it was a surprise in many quarters that they pulled out now, but from the beginning, the Russians did say that this was not going to be another Afghanistan, which was one of the criticisms leveled against the Russians, and that they always had the intention to leave. The official reason given by the Russian president is that they've achieved their goals vis-a-vis terrorism, vis-a-vis fighting Islamic State. Certainly, he has put Assad in a position that it's highly unlikely now, and this is something that the United States has, with time, come to realize. It's highly unlikely that Assad is going to leave anytime soon, and he is going to be part of whatever political transition happens in Syria, which is something the Russians wanted from the beginning. So in that respect, the Russians won.
I beg to differ on this last point, even though Paula is not only an expert, but have visited Syria several times. When Putin and Obama met in Antalya for the G20 last November, they conferred privately. And whatever transpired between the two of them, they must have reached some sort of understanding. And the Russian spokespersons have been very precise, including Foreign Minister Lavrov, regarding Assad's personal fate as distinct from the regime's. They are going to prop up the Assadite regime. Bashar Assad personally may not survive this process. And there are many reasons for it. The Russians are afraid that the phenomena of regimes being toppled might spread even into Russia itself. And also Syria is a client state. They want to show that they are not going to let such regimes go by the sideway.
Ms. Slier, your response?
I wouldn't argue with that. I would say that a lot of people get confused that they say that Russia's interest in Syria was solely to keep Assad in place. Russia's agenda in Syria really was to ensure Russia's strategic interests. It's much more important for the Russians that their naval bases, and now they have 4 bases, 2 Air Force bases and 2 naval bases that they're developing inside Syria, much more important for them that they have that kind of presence in the country than it's Assad per se or whoever. It's just that for the Russians, the Assad regime was the regime that they could count on the most to secure their interests inside Syria, and hence it came line in line with propping up Assad. Sorry, just one quick thing. You are right. I mean, the Russians have in private meetings said that they have put pressure on Assad. They're not tied to Assad per se, and there was some pressure being put on him to actually think about stepping down. But again, the big question for the Russians is, are our own self-interest going to be preserved?
Well, the question here is whether the Russian actions were in part in order to try and align their interests together with Western interests to try and divert their focus, or Western focus actually, from Ukraine to the Middle East, which is also a big interest both from the United States but also from European powers. Something that I'd like to understand from you, Mr. Alterman, do you think that this alignment has brought about Russian successes in the international arena?
Well, look at the facts on the ground in Ukraine. The Russian troops went into Crimea and they haven't left. The Russian rebels are active, or Russian-backed rebels are active in eastern Ukraine and are still there. So in point of fact, the Russians have made gains in Ukraine geopolitically. Now, whether that's because of what they've done in Syria, it's a bit of a cause and effect that's hard to trace, but at least it's possible.
Mr. Owen, also on top of that, do you think that the West does perceive this as a Russian maneuver on that matter?
In President Obama's series of conversations with Jeffrey Goldberg, leading to the Goldberg piece on the Obama Doctrine in the Atlantic magazine and website, Obama points out that Putin started his adventures when George W. Bush was president in Georgia in 2008. And Russian troops are still in Georgia. They are also in Moldova. And other analysts have pointed out that Putin, as prime minister under Yeltsin, started his career or his rise against the Chechens in 1999. He became president shortly thereafter because he managed to capture some of the sentiment of the Russian people. Now, as Obama describes it, Georgia and other places adjacent to Russia are core interests for Russia. Syria may not be a core interest, but geographically it's closed. For the United States, Syria is not core. NATO is, the Balkans is, the Baltics and other places. So there is a sort of coexistence between the European allies that the United States has and Russia. Syria, they can find a solution for.
Slier.
I want to comment on the Ukraine point. Again, there's a lot of theories as to why the Russians have pulled out, and they pulled out this week. But one of the theories relating to Ukraine is whether or not there was a deal under the table that we're not just aware of between the Russians and the Americans. Ukraine is infinitely more important to the Russians than Syria ever will be. So the suggestion is that perhaps the Americans said to the Russians, do what you want in Ukraine, or we'll turn a bit of a blind eye to Ukraine, but give us Syria. And in the sense of give us Syria, leave Syria, because that's what the Americans have been pushing for a long time. Having said that, Russia still faces isolation on the international stage, but even worse than that, it's still suffering from sanctions that are imposed on the country because of what happened in Ukraine. At the moment, the ruble is something like 30 rubles to a dollar, whereas, 70 rubles to a dollar, whereas 2 years ago it was 33. So it's also very expensive for Russia to maintain its military presence inside Syria and also to continue operating in Ukraine. So Ukraine is an important factor, as you rightly pointed out, by bringing up
plus
this
the low
conversation.
price of oil.
Absolutely. And also another point in Ukraine, to go where Ms. Slier was going, is that it's infinitely more important to Russia than it is to the United States. So it's clear that Russia is going to be much more invested in the Ukrainian arena than the United States will be able to be.
Another point of contention between the United States and Russia, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has just conducted some ballistic missile testings, according to them, been successful ballistic missile testing. On the one hand, they say that it's a deterrent against Israel, but at the same time, it does break certain sanctions which have been imposed back in July against the Islamic Republic, against nuclear-capable missiles. So at the same time, we're seeing a certain game with the West, but also a protection from Russia, which came out to the defense of the Russians, saying there is no breach here. Or
Yes.
what's going on there?
The sanctions having to do with missiles were imposed by the Security Council. And obviously, if you want to have the Security Council do anything, you need the Russians and the Chinese in order to avoid a veto. But the watchword here is containment, both in Syria and in Iran. The American administration, which is in power until January 20th next year, is content with containment. It doesn't want to roll back the Iranian regime. It wants to help the moderates fight the hardliners. So it is not going to do a lot regarding the missile
So the statements by Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, were just for show?
Rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly rhetoric because President Obama wants to divide the Middle East, or at least the Muslim part of it, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran is not a client of the United States. In Syria, it is beholden to Russia, as is Syria and as is Hezbollah. So they have a sort of awkward arrangement there, the Russians and the Americans, regarding Iran.
Mr. Alterman.
To Israel's frustration, the United States is not going to do anything meaningful on this. I agree with Mr. Oren said. This is about containment, at least for the time being. And I want to also say, it is true that it's for the time being until this administration, until President Obama finishes his term in January 20th, 2017, but maybe afterwards. Look at what's happening on the campaign trail in the United States. Donald Trump, while he says he wants to bomb the hell out of ISIS, that's not necessarily his foreign policy view overall, including in the Middle East.
How do you view this, Ms. Slier, especially that Moscow is now playing in one way, if it is indeed just for show, what Samantha Power did state at the UN earlier this week, it does give it a way out, saying, listen, we tried, but Russia is vetoing this or is not really going to permit us from doing anything about Iran. But at the same time, they're also inviting, or they invited earlier this week, the Israeli president, Reuven Rivlin, to Moscow, an invitation by Putin, signaling also a very strong message to the United States, who just a few days earlier have heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu's office that he's canceling a trip to the United States, which was scheduled for the 20th of March. So how is this game now going along with so much frustration on the one hand in Israel towards the United States, but also a lot of frustrations from the United States towards the situation and the improvement of relations between Israel and Russia?
It's a very delicate game. I think it would be wrong to say that the Russians are in bed with the Iranians. I mean, when the Iranian nuclear deal was signed, there was disagreement within Russian circles themselves. The Russians are concerned that the Iranians are moving into their traditional sphere of influence in Azerbaijan and those kind of former Soviet states in the Caspian Sea. They don't want to see a nuclear Iran. They don't want to see Iran testing them for whether it's energy, oil, or what other supplies. So it has to play that kind of balancing game. But vis-a-vis Israel, the Russians, and all of this forms part of the bigger picture. I think most people would say that as much as the Americans are trying to withdraw from the region, the Russians are trying to move in. For the Russians, the American withdrawal plays into their hands. It's an opportunity for the Russian president he sees Russia as a superpower. Many people would disagree with that statement, but this is an opportunity to move in where the Americans were. With the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for some time now, they've been trying to put themselves as a broker in place of the Americans or alongside the Americans. So all of this is part of that bigger, and you used the word game, the bigger political game of Russia kind of increasing its presence here in the Middle East, particularly now, and at an opportune time that the Americans are pulling out, and also following the Arab Spring, where I think the Russians played the game better. That's my opinion. Countries like Egypt that see Russia now as not they can't rely on it. It kind of betrayed its former friends. A lot of that is played into Russia's hands.
Well, whether the Russian Federation played it better or the Americans played it worse, it's a question, Mr. Owen.
The Russians are part of the diplomatic process, whatever there is, because they are part of the quartet. The EU, the UN, United States, and Russia are the four members of the quartet, and they are going to release an important statement soon, within several weeks, which may shape the the rest of the year diplomatically. Now, I happened to have accompanied former President Peres to Moscow in late 2012. He was Rivlin's predecessor, and Putin put out a grand show for him too. But they have no illusions regarding the power of Israel's presidents. They know that the prime minister is pulling the strings here. They want to be perceived as not anti-Israeli and pro-Jewish. It is very important for Putin, whenever an Israeli dignitary comes by, to show him that he is supporting Soviet Jewish institutions. But in addition to that, if you take the record of the last 2.5 years, from the chemical arms agreement that the United States and Russia had regarding Syria, and then the Iranian plan, and now whatever is happening regarding Syria, you see a pattern whereby Russia, alongside the United States, is a positive force, a force for good.
Mr. Alterman.
Yeah, no, these are important dynamics. I mean, for Israel, from Israel's perspective, there's a choice between two potential strategies. One is bandwagoning with the United States, which has been the basic Israeli strategy for the better part of 3 or 4 decades. And the other is some element of balancing between the United States and other rising powers or other global powers. I think there's a contest between these two ideas within the Israeli establishment and policymaking community. But I have to say, and we saw it with comments from Michael Oren in the Israeli press last Friday, that it's impossible for Israel to count on the United States completely. And there is some element of balancing, especially with the rise of Asia, especially with the Russian activity in the region, that Israel needs to rely on. It's no accident that the Israeli Foreign Ministry's Director General, Dori Gold, was in Africa this week, even in South Africa, a country that's had troubled relations with Israel, again, as part of this larger balancing policy, which goes way beyond the United States or even Russia.
With Israel aiming for $40 billion over the next decade, would they get it from Congo?
No.
Or from Russia?
And that's the
I
complexity
don't know
of
if
the
they'll get it
strategy.
from Russia either at the moment.
Yeah, that's also true.
Nonetheless, there is a certain perception in the Middle East right now that Russia has gained momentum when it comes to the American vacuum. There has been the power which is perceived as a Soviet power on the one hand, even though it's a mirage that has taken form in today's Russia. Not that I'm diminishing its power in the Middle East, but at the same time, it's not really there. That said, there is Saudi Arabia and other countries who are angry with the United States right now and are flying out to Moscow to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and with Putin in order to strengthen relations with the Sunni Arab world, even though that Russia is supporting the Shiite Muslim world right now. What is happening there?
Well, the Russians are no fans of any radical Muslims, Sunnis or Shiites. They don't want their own Muslim population to rise in arms. But one interesting point is that we are talking as if Putin and Russia are one and the same. And this is because we don't have an inkling regarding decision-making in the Kremlin. Under the old Soviet rule, at least we knew who was a member of the Politburo and had some sort of idea regarding the decision-making process.
So, Amir, why is that important? Because, I mean, the latest polls are 89.9% of Russians support the Russian president. So does he not speak for them?
Yes, he does. It's not as if Putin is doing anything against the will of the Russian people, but the decision-making process is within his head, which is why it is very difficult to decipher what is going to happen beforehand. Now, the bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy or the foreign affairs bureaucracy is supportive of that. A couple of years ago, there was the Gerasimov doctrine. The chief of staff of the armed forces, General Valery Gerasimov, came out with the doctrine, which is a mirror image of the American one. The American military sees Russia as a near-peer rival. They fear it. If you read the statements by the commanding generals of the European Command, the outgoing General Breedlove and the incoming General Scaparotti, you see that they really fear Russia and they are putting pressure on the administration to return some forces which were withdrawn from Russia after the Cold War ended. Now they are going back partly in order to reassure the European allies.
Ms. Slier, please.
Well, just while I was listening to you, and you were saying like Russia's making all these alliances, both in the Shia world and in the Sunni world, I think, again, one of the main reasons the Russian president gave as to why they got involved in Syria was to stop the spread of terrorism. Terrorism is a huge issue, of course, for the United States. People return back home. But geographically speaking, we're talking about the Middle East is so much closer to Russia and Russia's borders than it is to the United States. And I think the latest figures are something like between 5,000 and 7,000 Chechens that are fighting inside Syria or were fighting inside Syria. So I think part of Russia wanting to step up its presence in the Middle East, and also there's financial, economic,
Is it
and all
as
those.
significant, though, in a globalized world?
I think it is significant because I think it's not just about those people fighting in Syria, it's about those people coming back and fighting inside Russia. I think there's always been problems amongst, I mean, maybe that's a generalization, but, you know, there are problems amongst the Muslim population inside Russia in terms of, and particularly Chechnya, in terms of confronting Putin. And it's something that he has spoken about repeatedly. So I think part of it is also just hedging your bets and making alliances in the Middle East.
You have to define terrorism, because if Hezbollah is one of your allies in the fight against terror, and Hezbollah itself is defined by Israel and others, now including the Gulf states, as a terrorist organizations, it's one terrorist fighting another.
But it's exactly the same question we had in Syria. Who the Russians regarded as terrorists were people that Europe and the United States regarded as moderate rebels. So we're going to have that conversation on every single topic.
Right, and
This brings me actually to a question and a point which was stated by Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon this week regarding weaponry of Russia coming into the hands of internationally recognized terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and other organizations in the region. What do you have on that, Mr. Owen?
Well, this has been a concern for Israel for months, for years, and Israel has drawn red lines at the provision of advanced weaponry, at least to Hezbollah, and Israel's attacked convoys doing that long before the Russians were involved in Syria, and including while the Russians were involved in Syria. For Israel, this is a red line. Everyone has been content, or at least not opposed Israeli action on this. Again, with the Russians now leaving Syria, with Iran potentially taking a stepped-up role, and going back to something Ms. Slier said, I think this rivalry between Russia and Iran is one of the most underreported stories in the Middle East. It's a fascinating story happening beneath the surface. But with the Iranians coming back, the question is, will there be an escalation on this front? And
Mr.
that's
Owen?
an open question.
The Russians have been on notice that Israel is going to act against supplies of weapons from whatever source on their way to Lebanon. For them, it doesn't seem to raise such a big issue. They are more concerned when Israelis or Western arms defeat their weapons. If there are surface-to-air missile batteries and the Israeli Air Force knows how to suppress or destroy them, it casts a shadow over the technology, over the ability, sophistication of the Russian makers. But if they are intercepted on the ground, why do they care? They sold the weapons. Now let the customer beware.
Slier.
Everyone's making such a big deal about the Russians leaving Syria, but to be fair, there's several hundred soldiers or military personnel that are remaining behind, and sophisticated weaponry the Russians are keeping in
The
Syria.
S-400 is still staying there, if I'm not mistaken.
As far as I know, it is, and that's what people are not actually talking about enough, is that if the Russians feel that they need to come back into Syria, within hours, their jets can be bombing the sites of Islamic State and whomever. So,
But we have a precedent, you know. The Russians, when they had such a large presence in Egypt in 1970, following the Israeli deep bombing raids, were evicted in 1972. But they did leave Scud brigades, surface-to-surface missiles, and others, which actually took part in the Yom Kippur War. They always leave some foothold, even in Cuba, following the Cuban
Yes, but
Missile
Mr.
Crisis.
Owen, when you're looking at the strategic value of certain aspects, you're a military expert in many circles. And when you look at the current situation of Russia in Syria, the S-400 represents air superiority in every spectrum, something the Russians were not able to implement in Syria unless they would have entered the way they did. and without all the alarm that would have been brought after something like that. How does this actually play the significant role in the constellation of Middle East power struggles?
They have three limited goals in their limited presence in Syria. One is force protection. Their own force must be protected from the air, from the ground, so they are protecting themselves. The other one is regime protection. If Assad were to come under some surprise attack, because you can't rely on the rebels to keep quiet for the entire period of the negotiations on peace or partition, then the Russians will intervene. And the third point is anti-Turkey, because they now have a base adjacent to Turkey from the south. Usually, of course, they are from the north regarding Turkey. Now they are to the south of Turkey, and it will serve as a warning, because remember, this all started after their jet was downed by the Turks.
Well, we don't have very much time left, and that is why I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a last statement on the matter. How do you perceive the situation coming about in the next few weeks?
I think you're going to invite all of us back in to have this conversation again, because I think Russia's not going anywhere. I think it's part of the Russian foreign policy to maintain its presence in the Middle East, to maximize it, to take advantage of what is happening, to read the political map. So I certainly think that the Russian president once said that the biggest disaster of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think this is his way of actually trying to recounter that.
Mr. Alterman?
Well, it's fascinating. Ms. Slier just said that Russia is not going anywhere. The United States is not going anywhere either. And the United States isn't anywhere right now and isn't going to be anywhere. It's fascinating to look back on this conversation. We talked a lot about Russia, a lot about Israel, some about Iran, very little about the United States. And it's no coincidence. The United States is a backseat in Syria. It's no coincidence that Jeffrey Goldberg started his article on Obama's foreign policy with the decision in 2013 not to attack after the chemical attack by Assad's forces. This is a symbol of American, at least caution in its policy in the Middle East, and it's not limited to Obama. This continues long after January 20th.
Mr. Owen?
The Obama legacy is leading from behind. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, is very much forward-oriented, and he wants to show the world that he is taking the initiative, either in going into Syria or in leaving Syria. He is calling the shots.
Well, as we said before, it's not that Russia made a great decision. It's that the United States didn't do the right decision. Thank you so very much for coming here, Mr. Owen Alterman, Mr. Amir Oren, and Ms. Paula Slier. It's been a pleasure. And I'd like also to thank our viewers. We will see you next week. You just watched Jerusalem Studio. If you were enriched by the program, please consider supporting Heaven TV7 Jerusalem. Call us at 0600-10077 or send your donation using the bank account reference number on the screen. You can also donate via PayPal. Jerusalem Studio is made possible by your donation.